next immunity, we have Dr. Judith Bronstein. She's an ecologist and evolutionary biologist who researches mutualism. Dr. Bronstein obtained her Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Michigan and her Bachelors of Arts from Brown University as an independent major focused on the use of ecological theory in environmental policymaking. She has edited multiple books and volumes, including The Mutualism, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2016, and is currently a distinguished professor at the University of Arizona in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Entomology, where she focuses on the ecology and evolution of interspecific interactions, particularly on mutually beneficial ones, mutualism. She has received several honors and awards over her career, including being the past president of the American Society of Naturalists and the recipient of the American Society of Naturalists Distinguished Achievement in the Conceptual Unification of Biological Sciences Award. She was also elected the Fellow of the Ecological Society of America, has received the Pillar of Excellence Award from the University of Arizona, and is a distinguished and received the Distinguished Service Award from the National Science Foundation, just to name a few awards and honors. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Bronstein.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
Would you start off by expanding more on your educational and professional journey that has led you to where you are right now?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Northeast US, and I was a high schooler in Boston. And at the time, it was sort of the first environmental crisis in the US. This was the start of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, because pollution in the US was astonishing, like nothing we can believe now with, how bad it was. And new laws were put in place. It was the beginning of Earth Day. And I had a very strong environmental conscience. And so I thought I was really passionate about the environment and about biology, but I also really cared about environmental policy and global change, although we didn't really use those words at that time. And so I thought I wanted to combine those. So I went to Brown and I made up my own major, which you could do and still can do at Brown. The idea being to take modern theory in ecology and apply it to solving environmental problems, something that's pretty common now, but wasn't then. And over the course of a couple of years, I realized that I wasn't all that interested in policy world. I had some research experience, some work experiences that didn't really enjoy very much, but I loved finding out how the world worked in terms of how ecological systems were put together. So by the end of my college years, I had sort of put aside the thought of going into environmental law or policymaking, and I decided to continue in basic science. So I went to University of Michigan, and it's kind of an interesting story from the perspective of women in science, because I was the first graduate student of a woman named Beverly Rathke, who had been a faculty wife at Brown, who was not given a position at Brown, was allowed very occasionally to teach a course, even though she was a very, very highly respected ecologist. And she ended up leaving Brown, leaving her husband, and getting a job at Michigan, which is one of absolutely the top departments in the country, to start her own independent career. And I knew her at Brown, and then I followed her essentially, and I became her first graduate student at Brown. And I had a great time. I was at Michigan for 6 years. I had a hard time deciding what to work on. I ended up taking a course in the tropics on tropical biology. There are these graduate courses in Costa Rica, some other countries, but Costa Rica is the big one. I went there and I sort of found my passion of what it was I wanted to study. And I finished my dissertation. I did 1 year of postdoc in France. It was a really cool project, but frankly, I chose it because I had the opportunity to have someone pay me to go to France for a year, which seemed pretty cool. And then I started a second postdoc in Canada, in Alberta, and then I got the job at Arizona. So I ended up at University of Arizona, and I have been there ever since. Many faculty, more and more, over the years that they're a faculty member, have been at multiple institutions, and I haven't. I was young when I was hired, and I'm still there, and I still honestly feel like the youngest faculty member, and I'm really not. Like the people who were all there when I was hired have all retired. So yeah, I've been there a long time.
Thank you so much for sharing your career path with us. Could you expand more about what you do at the University of Arizona and what your current position is?
Sure. I'm a full professor. I have a nice title, which is University Distinguished Professor, which sounds like it should be about research, and it isn't. It's a teaching recognition, actually, which I mean I'm thrilled about, but nothing in the name University Distinguished Professor would lead you to think that. My time, as the vast majority of professors in the US, is divided up three ways. It's research, teaching, and service. So typical of a university, about 50% of my time is expected to be research. And that means getting grants, doing my research. They put no bounds on what I do. It doesn't even have to fit into the description of my department. But what they expect is that I'm churning out papers and I'm bringing money. I also have a full lab of graduate students and some postdocs that, they're doing research with me. So it counts as research. It also counts as teaching because I'm mentoring them. Then I teach. Our teaching loads are pretty light, so that makes up like 30% of my load. So I teach half of the large undergraduate course in ecology every fall, and I coordinate a graduate course for the first year graduate students in ecology, also in the fall. I do a lot of guest lecturing. Right now, I've been doing a adult ed course in my field for retirees around Tucson, and I've gotten opportunities to like go to Brazil and do a short course in the field and things like that, and that's a lot of fun. And then the other 20% is service, by which we mean being on university committees and doing editorial work and helping out on national initiatives. And I have invested in that far, far, far more than most people do. And I really love it. I have a few professional societies that I'm very dedicated to, that, like the American Society of Naturalists, that I've been in one position or another for a lot of years. And I also probably, to me, the most fun of anything in my career, it's a hard call, but it's probably editing. I really, really love editing. So I've been editor-in-chief of a journal. I'm now a co-editor of a journal. And I really love that, because and maybe you're going to ask me this later, if I hadn't been a professor of ecology and evolution, like what would I have been? I would have been a professor of something else. I'm just like a professor, right? And it probably would have been English literature or history or something like that. And I love writing. I love working with writing. So that sort of is a way to indulge in that part of me, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I guess going back to your previous answer on sort of your career and your career trajectory, you mentioned that you were very passionate about the environment as a high schooler, and that's what led you to going more into ecology and policy making when you were at Brown. Was there a specific point within that timeline or before that where you knew that you wanted to pursue a career in STEM? And was there anyone who inspired you?
Yeah. There are people who I didn't want to have to deal with. So that's like, I was anti-inspired. I worked at the Rhode Island Department of Transportation for a summer, and I got to see what it would actually be like to do environmental policy making in a state office. And it was really kind of dreadful. I had a lot of really good conversations with them about baseball. I'll just put that. Luckily, I was a big Red Sox fan because it just wasn't the kind of intellectual environment I wanted. The people that were there doing the work I was with were just not, they weren't intellectually driven, and that's what I was looking for. Conversely, the day I stepped onto the university campus at Brown, I was like, a university is my home forever. I don't want anybody to ever make me leave. And finally, I realized, like, for all my, idealism about wanting to change the world, I just belonged in a university, and I'm just a professor through and through. And, yeah, you could say I gave up the chance to change policy and so on. But now more and more, most of my students, at least in one way or another, are applying their research to climate change issues. Part of my work, I've certainly applied to taking basic knowledge and sort of figuring out how we can use them to make better decisions. So I'm not in the policy world, but the basic science I would say contributes to, to that kind of goal.
Just to summarize for our viewers, so it was really that summer where you were involved in environmental policy that you realized that you wanted to go more into like the scientific and academic world and decided to become a professor. And you've also mentioned that if you weren't the professor that you are right now, you'd be another type of professor.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you weren't that professor, maybe another type of professor.
Yeah. And the majority of people in my field would never, ever give you that answer. They would say, if I hadn't gone into biology, I would have gone into environmental policy making, environmental law. I would have been a park ranger. I would have been a forest ranger. So they would have stayed environmental. It's just that what they ended up with was a professor. And that's what's so different for me. It's like, it had to be a professor.
Yeah. What do you really enjoy about being a professor? And, on the flip side, what do you find like the hardest part of being a professor?
Yeah. There's very, very few guidelines about what you're supposed to do. So, in a normal job, you kind of know, there's expectations. You have to get such and such done by such and such date, and there's clear benchmarks. And you're generally working with people who are doing something fairly similar to you. I mean, that's the sort of typical workplace thing. And our job is so vague, right? We're supposed to be smart and do good science and be able to convince funding agencies and convince journals to publish our work. But we have to figure out how to do that ourselves. So everybody is completely different. There's a million paths to do it. So there's a million ways to do it right, and also kind of a million ways to do it wrong, right? So the one thing you can say about being a professor, sort of the most negative, is enough is never enough. It's always better to write more papers and bring in more grant money and more grant money. And you can totally run yourself into the ground in a very unhealthy way because the work is never done. You have to decide for yourself. It's like, I cannot do any more today, because there's always a career advantage of being the person that does a little more. And that's hard. So you have to be insanely self-motivated. You can't wait for someone to tell you what to do next. You got to figure out for yourself what to do, and you have to drive yourself. And people drive themselves into the ground. And a lot of women decide this is just not a healthy career. I mean, the idea that more is always better, more, more, more. Well, how do you take time for yourself? Taking time for yourself is always time away from career advancement in academia. And that's really unhealthy.
Right.
But that's what it's like. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, how do you overcome that challenge in your day-to-day life as a professor?
Mm. Did I overcome it? I
Mm.
don't know. You have to be kind to yourself and set boundaries. Something that people who go into this are not terrifically good at doing. And so we run ourselves ragged a little bit. I mean, with I think a lot of us, we find that putting in as much time as we possibly can without getting ourselves sick is getting us a good level of advancement. Right. And at that point, you realize that you can cut back a little bit. You don't have to do more. But, it's a huge issue. People who want a very, very well-balanced, well-rounded life, who want to live geographically where they want to live, um, are generally people who don't stay in academia. Right. Because that is another thing about it. Academic jobs are really hard to get. And so you end up going wherever the job is, or you decide, and as most of my graduate students have, and I've had brilliant grad students, but they don't want to live just wherever they can get a job. They want to live in Arizona, or they want to live in Zurich, or they want to live in Alaska. I mean, these are all cases of students I have. And, if you want to live in Alaska, there's like 2 universities. And there'll be one job every 10 years, and there'll be 400 applicants for it. So you can't design the job the way you want it.
Thank you for sharing that insight and for sharing your advice. I guess moving on to our next question, could you name some of like the highlights of your career, or some point in your career where you feel like you've had an impactful moment or project that contributed to your field of science?
Ooh, good question.
It doesn't have to be major as well. It could also be like something personally that you felt was a growth in either your professional career or personal life.
mhm. Um, well, getting married. My husband just walked by, and there's a good funny personal story about that, I'll tell you. But getting married and then having a kid after I got tenure, so I have one child, um, and realizing that I could actually fit all that in, and it made me happier. That was great. I've gotten amazing opportunities to work abroad, and that always combines fun because, last year I got to live in Berlin for a year while I was on sabbatical. And I got great research done and made good scientific connections, but it was also just a heck of a lot of fun, right? And right now I'm in Oxford for 3 months, and the opportunity to have a career that allows me to travel and explore the world, I think is pretty special. Um, we all like to get awards. So the awards I've gotten, everybody thinks like, oh, I'm not as good as I could have been. I didn't achieve as much as I could have. And then an award comes out of the blue and just makes you feel like, well, maybe I didn't actually screw it all up. Um, so that's really fun. I would say the achievements of my graduate students and postdocs have been kind of a big thrill, seeing them now establish their careers and, feeling like I had something to do with that. And some of them had a very rough start under the mentorship of other people. And then they came to my group. And I feel like I really helped them. I helped them regain their confidence, both as scientists and as people.
Right.
And I feel really good about that.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point you've mentioned in terms of like mentorship and sort of supporting your graduate students find their place and get a hold of what they want to do and regain their confidence.
Mhm.
Was there any mentorship or support network in your life that you feel like helped you within your career?
I wish I could say yes. It's hard to say yes. My advisor was wonderful and very personally supportive, but she was struggling with her own career. And I think she thought, and this was similar for my other academic mentors, they looked at me, they saw me as being so driven
Mm,
that they didn't think I needed mentorship.
mm,
They thought they had better put their attention into the people who were struggling. They looked at me and basically said, "Oh, thank God, somebody I don't have to spend time mentoring because everything's on track." That didn't make me feel real great, right? Because I felt like I'm sure I wanted to be mentored. I wanted some good advice. But, and then there were people that were difficult people. Not that difficult, honestly. I've had it very easy. But because of that, because of my own sense that I wanted more mentorship than I got, I think it's turned me into the mentor I am.
mm.
And I give a lot of mentorship. I give mentorship to people who don't have mentors, like their advisors and colleagues are not doing their job in mentoring. And so I spend a lot of time working with them because I want to make sure everybody has what they need, honestly.
Yeah.
And the fact that I succeeded without that, you know, I'd never expect that of anyone. It's not right to expect that of anyone. So I'm not going to say like, well, I didn't need it. I don't see why anybody needs it. It's like, no, everybody needs it.
Right. Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you for sharing that. And you definitely think that like mentorship plays a big role, and it's great that you're providing that opportunity for so many of the
Hmm.
students that you know. So
Thank you.
yeah,
Well, it's kind of interesting because the subfield of ecology I'm in, I study mutualism, which is cooperative interactions. And, I'd like to say people who study cooperation are just really nice people, and they kind of generally are. But the field didn't really exist when I got into it. There were one or two people who were leaving academia that had started it. And so I very quickly was the senior person in this tiny field. And the field has really grown. And I'm the oldest person in it. So I've mentored what sometimes feels like the vast majority of people in this field. Everybody knows me. And they know they can rely on me for recommendation letters and for reviews of their papers and to write recommendations when they're up for awards. So, simply by the choice of my science, I've ended up in a kind of unusually deep mentoring role, which is fun.
so moving more into like what this project is about, which is like elevating stories and
Mhm.
highlighting visibility of women in STEM. I guess what are your thoughts about representation of women in STEM, and how do you believe like diversity and inclusion impact STEM innovation?
Um, well, when I got into it, I think there were 10 grad students who came in at the same time as me, and there were 3 women and 7 men. Now, if you would look at a group of 7 coming in ecology and evolution, it's more like 3 men and 7 women. So it's flipped. It's female biased. What has not flipped is the number of women who are applying for faculty positions is very, very consistent. And this is true through the sciences. It's very consistently lower for women. So women are disappearing. We say there's a leaky pipeline.
Right.
From the number of women who go in to get a PhD, most of them will not be there by the time they're applying for academic positions. And that's a huge worry. And there's been a lot of research on that, about what's going on. And to some extent, women decide they don't want to do this for their lives. And some of that is very, very healthy. I mean, it is, as I hope I've portrayed, it's a crazy job. It is a totally all-consuming life. And a lot of people in general, a lot of women just don't want that. They don't want 90% of their attention being on their job. And that's good, right? It's nothing that says we have to have 50-50 representation of men and women. Everybody should be able to do what they want career-wise. And I do think we're at the point, at least in my field, which is probably, it's not chemistry and physics, which might be very different, where a great woman in the job pool gets a huge amount of attention, and we're really making inroads in looking at hiring women. So I think it's better,
Right.
and of course there's many, many dimensions of diversity. I'm just talking here about women. So we're leveling the playing field, but we're very far from parity. And people feel very differently about if that's a symptom of something bad or if just everybody's gravitating to what they want to do. And that's not a bad thing. But there's a million dimensions of diversity, and there's other groups that have struggled in other ways. I think that ecology, evolutionary biology is exceedingly aware of DEI issues right now. There's a huge amount being written, everything from, the inherent legacy of racism in old style natural history to what we call helicopter science, which is basically what I did for my dissertation. You land in another country, you do your research, you don't interact a whole lot with the people who live there, and then you leave and you publish your results in English back home. That's being done away with. I think we're exceptionally open to the full gender rainbow. And that's a real mark of my field. And also, strangely, in entomology, which used to be a very, very strictly white male biased field. And it's so incredibly and interestingly diverse now, the people who study insects. It's really cool. But there's more work to do, and some of the work involves finally catching up with the people who have been abusing the system and sexually harassing people and writing from a racist perspective and so on. And some of this are the biggest names in the field. And I mean, my field is probably better than most this way. So, in the last 5 years or so, all of a sudden, this is catching up with people. When I was a graduate student, there was always bad behavior. And there was horrible behavior on the part of some of the senior people in the field. And we all knew it. But for a student to have made a fuss about it, to have gone to the department head or the president of the university, to have gone to the press, it's like, we didn't do that. That was not done. And I've thought a lot about, there's a lot of reasons for that. The world has changed. Now people are not getting away with stuff. And I think that's a really, really good thing. So when I was 2 years ago, when I was president of the American Society of Naturalists, this issue came up because awards that societies give tend to be named after famous people. Well, we're now looking at some of those famous people. We're looking at their legacy and how they behaved, who they trained, who they refused to train, things they wrote, people whose careers they furthered, how they interacted with women in their lab. And we're discovering that there's a lot of really unsavory stuff. And so my society, we decided to get rid of all those names of awards. And some of them are, the dominant figures in the history of our field. But you don't have to name awards after people, you just don't. So we changed all the award names to be, like make it clear what they were actually awarding, as opposed to being the so-and-so award. And there were people that were really furious about that, who think that we're not recognizing the scientific legacy of these men. But for the most part, there was a pretty positive response to us for doing this.
That's great.
I have about 5 minutes and then I'm going to have to go.
Right. So I guess we'll move on to our last question then, which is just reflecting back onto your career, and then also for the viewers who are watching this right now. If you had the option to give your younger self any advice, what would that be and why?
Lighten up. It was my graduate committee, I mean, they weren't the best mentors, but they looked at me and said, "Oh God, Judy's got to lighten up." And so like they would take me out to dance parties and things like that. They would take me to bars. It's like, we got to get her to stop thinking about work all the time and have some fun. So I think I must have been a real piece of work at that age. I loved what I was doing, but I was also very neurotically driven. And I think honestly, I would have gotten to the same professional stage while having a little bit more fun. So, I think that, for some people it would be like, I should have worked harder. It's like, no, I should have worked less hard.
Well, definitely thank you for sharing that advice. And thank you so, so much for being here. It's been an honor and a pleasure talking to you,
Oh,
Dr.
thank you so much. And it's great to be able to contribute to this initiative.